Thank you. Thanks, Michael. I'll touch on a few things. Thanks for having me this morning. I'm Jason Hellendrung with Tetra Tech, and I'm going to share a few things. I'm going to talk a little bit about Climate Ready Boston. I'm going to add a perspective to it about the partnerships that went into building that and getting to that. And I think it's a key item to discuss when we get into the Q&A. And Dan and Daniel and Ann and Wayne asked initially to also just talk a little bit about where do we fit in this world of sustainability and climate adaptation and climate resilience. How does it affect the work that we're doing? How does it affect our companies? Michael touched on it from the small business side. And so I want to talk a little bit about that and just how does that fit? How is it affecting what we've done, what we're doing now, what we'll be doing in the future? So I work in planning and design at Tetra Tech. I've just joined in the middle of May, and working in the Northeast, but then working across the company with our One Water initiative. So working with different groups across the country. And so just a little perspective on Tetra Tech and where does this fit within our realm of sustainability and climate adaptation. And so Tetra Tech, we're a consultancy. We're based in Pasadena. We have 16,000 people. So we're a large company. We're not a startup. We're hitting on all different aspects of engineering and science and environmental work. And so sustainability and climate adaptation is fully integrated into everything that we're doing. We operate internationally with 400 offices around the world. This is just a cross-section of some of the work that we do. A very heavy focus on water and all different aspects of water. But you see other aspects that tie to the environmental market and energy, touching on renewable energy, and then also our global work. So, this is intertwined with a lot of the work that we do all over the place. From the water perspective, that's a really strong focus of the work that we do. We've been ranked #1 in water by Engineering News Record for 14 straight years. And in terms of looking at what we do and evaluating what we do, we've been publishing the last several years our sustainability scorecard. We just issued in the spring our 2017 report looking back at 2016. And with that, we're evaluating our work. So we're looking at our projects and what we're doing from the water perspective, but other areas around energy, and kind of evaluating what we're doing on our projects and measuring that. We're also looking operationally. And so how are we working from a corporation, our offices, and what are the decisions that we're making as an office, looking at renewable energy in our offices, water usage, and how are we trying to conserve in some of those areas around the footprint that our actual operations and spaces have. And then with that, we're projecting ahead, and how does that look forward? And so it's not just some of the physical aspects, but from a corporation, are we growing? Is that giving an opportunity for young professionals to grow and take on new professional development opportunities? So that helps fit some of the growth strategies, not just from a hard infrastructure standpoint or a project standpoint, but our people standpoint. Just a few of the things that I'm doing over the last couple months since joining. I'm working with our team in New York on a program with New York State's Department of State. It's a transfer of development rights program. It's coming on the heels of Superstorm Sandy. We're looking at taking development rights from areas in the extreme risk area along the coast. Many of these areas were damaged during Sandy. We're focusing on Long Island. Taking those development rights, potentially putting them into a development rights bank, and then sending them into receiving areas as growth areas on Long Island. Those are areas around downtown centers or around transit, but taking some of those areas that are in the extreme risk areas where people were damaged and had to rebuild, and then moving them potentially to higher and drier places. Also working with our team in New York City on another effort in Long Island, again, coming on the heels of Superstorm Sandy. This is one of the implementation projects from Rebuild by Design, which was a program launched by HUD and funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, looking at long-term innovations and resilience to future storm threats. So these were areas that were impacted by Sandy. The Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force said, how do we start to look at this and break this cycle of people continuing to be damaged by these storms? So what are some of these long-term innovative solutions that we could start to look at? So we're looking at this area of Nassau County, and we're looking at inland flooding from stormwater. We're looking at coastal flooding, but all these different elements, and trying to prioritize this whole program on the Mill River in Nassau County. And last, working with our team in Detroit. We've been working with Detroit Water and Sewerage Department for a number of years. This is one element of it, but looking at, as part of their combined sewers and their MS4 permit, we're working with them on one layer of that permit around green infrastructure and how we can divert some of that water from going into their combined sewers. And we're actually taking it and treating it in these small pilot green infrastructure projects on some of these abandoned neighborhoods on the west side of Detroit that feed into the Rouge River. So just a couple of snapshots, but this is affecting work that we're doing everywhere, and we're trying to measure this across the board. So I'll shift to Boston, so Climate Ready Boston, and I'll step back a little bit before Boston because I think it's an important thing. Working in some of these communities that have gone through disasters have had a flood of money that comes in afterwards. It doesn't cover all of the damages. And the challenge in Boston is that we're looking proactively. Michael touched on some of the winter storms like Hercules and Nemo, but we haven't been hit with a major disaster since the blizzard of '78. And so how do we get people to move and act and focus on this when there isn't that disaster that's occurred? And the challenge in Boston is sea level rise. It's this incremental rising in the future. So a big challenge is how do we get people to focus on this effort around the impacts to sea level rise and flooding in Boston when we haven't had that hit. And so the challenge is funding. And there's been a lot of partnerships that have gone into it. And the challenge is this. This is Boston. This is about 1800. You see the Shawmut Peninsula and Washington Neck. I'll point out right here, Noodle Island and Governor's Island and Apple Island. That's East Boston and the airport. This right here is Dorchester Flats. That's the Seaport District. This right here, this is the Back Bay. So all of this area was filled. We have a well-protected harbor in Boston, and yet this area that was filled in the 17 and 1800s. It was filled to high tide at that time. It didn't anticipate sea level rise increasing. And so these are the areas that are most vulnerable as we look ahead today. And this is what we have today. This is a king tide on October 18th last year. This is Long Wharf, right by the aquarium. And you see the harbor walk actually under 6, 7, 8, 9 inches of water. This is during one of the astronomical high tides during the year. The tide cycle varies by a few feet, but these are the highest high tides. Turn around, this is the aquarium on the left. Custom House is straight ahead of us. Chart House is right on the right. Another area. This is just flooding. There is no storm event. There is no surge. This is just high tide seeping back in through storm sewers. This is Fort Point Channel. Just to the right, that is the site where GE is building their new headquarters. This is in the 10-year floodplain, not 100-year. This is a 10% annual chance of a flood. They're elevating their site about 4 feet. They've signed a 42-year lease. They've been looking at the sea level rise projections for Boston. But this is a site where they wanted to be because of access to Boston, access to the brain capital here, access to the world through Logan Airport. But the challenge is here. You see what it is just flooding today. And so stepping back before we get into Climate Ready Boston, setting some of the context. Right after Sandy, while Sandy was occurring, the Boston Harbor Association was preparing for the rising tide. And all these projections that they were talking about of what could happen with sea level rise in Boston occurred during Sandy. So they stopped the presses, did a rewrite. They issued in February of 13, started to project what were some of these vulnerable areas within Boston to sea level rise. And at the time, I was a principal at Sasaki. I'll share a little bit of the work that I've been doing, Ed had done while there. We looked at that. That was pretty interesting in that it started to communicate what those vulnerabilities are. We want to shift the thought, communicate it a little bit better, but then also try to shift the perspective to how do we adapt the city. So we launched this initiative. We ultimately had an exhibit in spring of 14 that started to look at what those aspects were. What were the areas that were vulnerable? So you can see some of these areas in blue, like the seaport, like Back Bay, areas of Cambridge and the airport, and started to introduce this catalog of these strategies of how to adapt. How could you adapt buildings? How could you adapt coastlines? How could you introduce new environmental considerations of habitat that could absorb a surge on, say, the harbor islands? What were the vulnerabilities to things like the T, or hospitals, or energy systems. And that was really a growth of that aspect, but it was an initiative that we got a lot of feedback from the city. They were happy that we were doing it. We got a lot of great feedback from TBHA, and starting to work with other partners like Green Ribbon Commission that's been pushing a lot and promoting a lot of these efforts as well. It led to a follow-up publication with TBHA on some of these adaptation strategies, which led to another step of the Boston Living with Water competition. Again, an initiative of drawing on people to help fill some of this gap, to look at what were some of these opportunities to adapt the city. This was launched October of 2014. That was the 2-year anniversary of Sandy at ABX in Boston. Started with a charrette that then led to the competition. That was introduced in June of 15, which ultimately got us to Climate Ready Boston. So all of these efforts that started to build for really about 3, almost 4 years, getting to the point of the city getting some grant funding from the Green Ribbon Commission and Barr Foundation, getting a grant from Coastal Zone Management, working with a team from UMass Boston, and then our team to actually do this vulnerability assessment and resilience strategy for the city. So I'll share a little bit of that work that we did in this effort. I'll touch on, first some of the climate projection consensus. A few of the slides that I saw earlier were the work that came out of this. UMass Boston managed a team of researchers, which include others from Northeastern and Tufts and Harvard and kind of all the great, bright minds, looking at MIT as well. If I didn't say MIT, I saw the look there, so had to get the plug in. But what are the climate threats for the city? Big one being sea level rise leading to coastal storm and coastal surge, as well as with extreme precipitation and temperature. So hitting on all of these, the biggest one really being that coastal flooding with sea level rise. And so we started to look, what do we look at in these different emission scenarios? So kind of a key thing to get in mind is, the emission scenarios can be managed, and that's going to impact the climate impacts and the changes. But looking at different ranges, here increases in precipitation over the years. Here, building off of some of the work and looking at impacts from extreme temperature. So this is what we're looking at for increases in days over 90 and 100 days. Today, we have about 1/10 of a day annually over 100 degrees. That's about 1 day every 10 years. In the future, we're looking at in the range of, what was our number? I think we're looking at, 25 to 90 days over 100, but up to 5 days over 100 degrees annually. So it's a 50 times increase as we start to look to the future. What does that mean? Boston today would start to feel more like Birmingham, Alabama. Big difference. The increases in sea level rise, again, working with those emission standards. And so what we did was we worked with information from BWSC with their stormwater flooding and work with Mass DOT with their coastal modeling. We had to calibrate it and come up with moderate likely scenarios combining the two. And so we came with those ranges, again, looking at those different ranges of emissions. And so, as we project ahead, 2030s, we're looking at about 8-9 inches potentially as the likely scenario. 2050, we're looking at starting in the 2050s, we're looking at 18 inches. Starting around the 2070s, our likely scenario is about 3 feet. And then that's about as far as we really look, because you see that range at 2,400, it starts to expand pretty wide. And at a 0.1% likelihood, you could actually even see 10 feet of sea level rise by 2,100. If we cut all our emissions a lot, it might be 2 feet. That range just gets so broad that we try to focus on these first 50 years as we look towards the 2070s. Another way of looking at that, just sort of the ranges associated with that. So what does that climate projection mean on the ground as we start to look at this with the vulnerability assessment? We looked at those factors, how it affected these different hazards around heat and stormwater flooding and coastal and riverine flooding. And then what does it mean to people, or the different components of our society, really? People, property, infrastructure, jobs. So what are the impacts on that? We did a very robust analysis around people and a social vulnerability analysis on those that are most in need of sort of help during these flood events. So looking at the elderly, children, people with disabilities or medical illnesses, low or no income. Those are the people that are impacted the most. So during some of these events. So how does that play out? We also work with our infrastructure team, and again, looking at partnerships. We worked with an infrastructure advisory group that included all of the public entities and agencies and departments that have a big footprint, like the Housing Authority or schools. We work with major institutions like the hospitals and colleges and universities like MIT and BU and UMass Boston. We work with all the utilities for the public agencies. We work with the private utilities. So all of these looking at what was vulnerable within this assessment. And so as we start to look at this, just kind of quick snapshots within Boston and what's impacted within different neighborhoods within these scenarios. So, looking at this early 2030s scenario of about 9 inches, we start to see, the greatest impact really in the Seaport District growing off of Fort Point Channel. And you see some of these areas along East Boston, a little bit in Charlestown, but here's this area around Fort Point, kind of just adjacent to the convention center. So sort of those impacts. And we were modeling this within different areas, the 1% storm, 1 in 100, the 10% as a 10-year storm. But then the key thing that we started to look at was the average monthly high tide, because that becomes really significant when we start to look towards 2070. I'll come back to that. As we start to look at these progressions and the 2050s model, the 18 inches of sea level rise starting, most likely around the 2050s, you see that starting to increase in those same areas. The concentrations in East Boston, that's along that kind of flood pathway along the East Boston Greenway. Start to see some areas of downtown, that area filled right around the aquarium and Harbor Towers. And then you see some of these areas starting to grow in South Boston, upwards of 50%. An important thing happens now when we add another 18 inches to that when we get to the 2070s, because you're going to see a spike. What's going to happen is this becomes this flood pathway into the south end and some of the inland neighborhoods. But these 30 and 50%, we go to 2070 now, and all of a sudden you see some of these areas along the coast that went from 30 to maybe 45 or 50 or 60% impacted. There's East Boston again and Charlestown and South Boston, but all of a sudden this massive pathway is opened into the south end, which inundates all of that area. And you see some of these other areas that are impacted. So major impacts to all of the neighborhoods of the city. And the key here is that as we start to look at this, that 1% annual flood chance, that 100-year storm that we look at in that 2030s scenario, that's 9 inches that we expect around the 2030s, that just about equals the average daily high tide when we look at 2070. So just to kind of repeat that 100-year, 1% frequency storm event in about 2030 is what we can expect as the average monthly high tide in 2070. It's not every day, but it averages out to about 225 days, again, because that tide cycle varies a little bit. The highest tides aren't always the highest, but a major, major impact. So what does that mean? Keep an eye here on the blue bar, because that's the 1% storm, and so tying that to flood insurance. But as we start to look at this, impacts on people, this is impacting in the 2070 scenario, 14% of the city. It's impacting about 85 to 90,000 people with that average monthly high tide. As we start to look at, with the 1%, sorry. As we look at buildings and then building value, projecting out to that 2070 scenario, what's vulnerable in that is looking at almost $80 billion of real estate at risk. So pretty dramatic. You see those numbers here. We looked at other aspects of looking at coastal and riverine flooding. And so this is the inland flooding, the urban flooding. Kind of the key here is that Boston Water and Sewer is consistently updating the work that they're doing to look at what's vulnerable and making adjustments and investments to improve those areas. You see what some of those impacts are in terms of what that's hitting 11,000 properties that are vulnerable to flooding. We looked at heat. This is heat mapping Each of these bands is a 1.25 degree. So these areas in red concentrate in Roxbury. Those are the areas that have about 3.75 degree warmer than other areas of Boston. And you see some of these areas along the coast, they're in coastal environments, they're vulnerable to coastal flooding. Well, those coastal breezes cool them, so it's a good place to be when it's hot. Not a good place to be with sea level rise. These are increases in deaths. So actually these are heat-related illnesses and deaths. So increases growing with that, you see sort of that increase expanding as well. With this, we developed a very high-level citywide resilience strategy, worked in a couple layers. We organized it around principles, so looking at multi-benefit solutions that kind of solve more than one problem, how we could phase things into building cycles, how do we work in kind of these multiple layers within all of these principles. And then we organized it around kind of 5 key areas. One is updating the climate consensus that I shared, making sure that we're tracking that data consistently, but then looking at how we better prepare and protect communities and neighborhoods, how we can protect some of our shoreline from that coastal flooding, how we can protect our infrastructure, and then how we can adapt buildings. So just kind of buzzing through these, looking at that climate consensus, and updating the mapping consistently, how we can start to work with our community programs and and build awareness amongst. Looking at different districts, so coming up with different district solutions. The city is actually going into this in more detail, where they launched in February, starting to work in Charlestown, East Boston. More recently, started working in South Boston. Right now, the city is focusing on Moakley Park as another initiative to start to look at how to protect that pathway that gets into Dorchester. Looking at kind of this layered system of looking at protecting our shorelines in different areas, and how can we do that through either gray infrastructure or green infrastructure. You can see some of the solutions kind of getting layered in here and communicating that, how we can protect some of these areas. Another key piece to this, expanding on that infrastructure advisory group. We brought them together. They need to keep coming together and sharing information around what are the investments that they're making and what are the assets that they have at risk. Key piece, we'll hear a little bit more about it from the microgrid side. One of the lessons learned from Sandy about looking at more district energy and microgrids that can go off the grid and can go into island mode during a storm and continue to serve. So what are some of the most vulnerable areas to serve energy within the city? Looking at some of that stormwater flooding and kind of continuing to build off of Boston Water and Sewer's green infrastructure plan to deal with some of that urban flooding. This is a key piece as we start to look at how do we adapt buildings, both with existing buildings and code for new construction, but starting to look towards a planned flood elevation, not today's base flood elevation, but look at a building and look at a planned flood elevation for how is a building being built for a design life. Is it 40 years, 50 years, 75 years? And so taking that into consideration. And so that's feeding into some of these aspects of how do we look at updating some of our zoning and building code, how do we retrofit existing buildings with some of that. So last piece, just looking at insurance and flood damages. And then one of the layers, actually a very important one, UMass Boston is continuing on this right now, starting to explore a harbor-wide barrier, looking at a couple different scenarios. I saved this last, not for least, but just a segue about this aspect of partnerships, all the different groups and organizations that have come together. This is some work that we're doing. This is the sapphire necklace. This is a concept that Bob Daler of Tetra Tech proposed in 1988 as the Boston Futures competition. Kind of didn't get too much traction for about 20 years, but when Sandy hit and some of that area started to look, this is one of the scenarios that's being explored as these harbor-wide solutions. So again, it emphasized that piece of what are the partnerships that need to come together to help move some of these initiatives ahead. It's not just all on the city, but it's really about everybody coming together with that. Kind of a couple key lessons learned around all these different pieces of work, but looking at how do we live with water, designing for multi-benefit solutions and a broad-based resilient framework, and really the partnerships to help create a strategy for implementation. I think the key piece, we've just scratched the surface, but with any of these kinds of investments, engagement, and community buy-in and support is a key component to pull that together. And so that's going to be the foundation for any of these major infrastructure investments that need to be made in the future. Thank you.